My name is Tamara Cortez, and this is my nonfiction book presentation on the book Shattered Innocence. Shattered Innocence is written by Robert Scott, and I chose this book due to current interest in TV shows such as Criminal Minds, and I've been listening to a lot of true crime podcasts, and I think they're super interesting, and this book definitely falls into one of those things that I really enjoyed reading. This picture at the bottom is a picture of JC Lee, and she was the girl who was kidnapped in 1991, and that is who this book is about. Shattered Innocence is a novel written by award-winning author Robert Scott, which entails the story of JC Lee Dugard, and more specifically her abductor Philip Craig Garrido, who held her captive for 18 years after kidnapping her while she was on the way to her bus stop. The story goes from Philip's childhood and what led him to be able to get away with the kidnapping of an 11-year-old girl in broad daylight. The first quote that I chose was, "I don't believe that the drug, in this case LSD, is responsible for creating either the obsession or the content or quality of the fantasy. I really don't believe the drug did that. I think the drug permitted it to flourish, so to speak, and survive, and until ultimately the drug permitted it to get acted out." And this was on page 168. So a little context on what is going on. Philip is the guy who kidnapped JC, and before the kidnapping in 1991, he had been arrested in the 70s for kidnapping and raping a woman in California and then taking her to Nevada. So he already had priors, and this was the first time that he was in court where a doctor who was called to testify was talking about how he believed that the only reason why he was acting this way was because the drugs kind of enhanced it. And I found this quote to be interesting because I started to wonder if the same thing applied to us as the readers. Do our personalities become darker / mysterious when we are not sober? Now, I'm not saying that we'll necessarily kidnap someone and take them across the border, but do we have a darker part to our personality that maybe isn't so bright and positive, and it's just contained at this moment because we are not on drugs? My second quote was that Phil had told her children should never go to a bus stop alone. They are no match for an adult. A little context on what's going on in this part of the book. It is towards the middle of it, and Philip has started a business, and he has a printing company, which basically means they make flyers and business cards, and he is talking to one of his clients, and he is telling her, hey, children, they shouldn't be alone while walking a bus stop. A guy who's an adult is a lot stronger than them. There's no way they can beat them in a fight or if they're trying to get away. So what I learned was that Phil knew what he was doing, even if it was maybe subconsciously. He was aware of what him and his wife, Nancy, had done. But what I found interesting and extremely ironic was that he was giving advice on the dangers of kids going to a bus stop alone, when he and people like him were the reason that statement was true. If people like him had gotten the help they needed, then walking to a bus stop in order to get to school shouldn't be such a dangerous thing. My third quote was, none of the actions by J.C. Dugard should be second-guessed about why she didn't run away. If you are alive after 18 years, you did the right thing. I don't care what you did, it was the right thing. And this was on page 327. I wouldn't say that I learned. I'd say I was reminded that sometimes you have to do certain things to survive, and that is okay. So we found out that J.C. Dugard actually had contact with the outside world. She had changed her name, obviously not legally, but in the family, Nancy, Philip's wife, and Philip knew her as Alyssa. And to the outside world, that's who she was known. She helped deal with the customers of Philip's business, and so she had connections with people across different parts of the state of California. And she also had two daughters, one in 1994 and one a couple years later. So I'm sure that she stayed in that household because she was protecting them. a lot of kidnappings end up with murder, and Jay-Z found a way to survive, and so that is something that should always be applauded. 18 years, it's a crazy amount of time. It's almost 2 decades. I haven't even been alive for 18 years, so it's crazy to think that someone has spent that much time with someone and is who is not their family and is, alive. Um, and so I thought that was really interesting. Up on the right, we have a picture of a magazine. It was one of the only pictures I found of her kids and her. And all of them, they're either blurred out or they're non-existent, or it's not actually their kids who are in the image. They live a pretty private life now, which is completely understandable. And I just thought that was pretty cool. Quote number 4 was Nancy Garrido asked me to tell JC and the kids she really misses them and loves them. She would obviously love to see them. I'm assuming the forces of evil won't allow that to happen. This was on page 387. So what I learned is that sometimes someone's mental illness blinds them. Nancy claimed she loved JC and her daughters. However, when she had the chance to get them out of that situation they were in, she didn't. So in the early 1990s, Philip was actually arrested for breaking parole on the whole kidnapping thing from the 70s. And during that time, Nancy had an opportunity that if she really cared about those kids, she could get them out of there, get herself some help while at it, because many believe she had Stockholm syndrome since Philip had brainwashed all of them, basically. And she didn't. She followed Philip's orders and kept them in the house. And it was very unfortunate. It was an opportunity that was missed. Therefore, I don't believe that she truly wanted to change in that moment. And then she believed that the forces of evil, who were the authorities, were keeping them apart. She believed that they belonged together, that they were a family, but in reality they weren't. The authorities weren't actually the forces of evil. The only true cold evil in that household was her husband, who kidnapped an 11-year-old girl. My last quote was, because of changes and improvements in the way sex offenders were monitored after all the news about JC came out, a 14-year-old Concord girl was saved from a similar fate. In a very real sense, that girl owed her life and freedom to JC Scott. JC. And then it's cop 468. This was towards the very end of the book. It was actually in the last section of the text. I learned that change doesn't necessarily happen within a week. It takes time. But what I found interesting is that throughout history, change only happens after following a tragedy or an event that harms people. Take this case for instance. Philip should have been under a lot more supervision because of what he had done in the past. His parole officers were to be checking in on him, periodically, pretty often. He was supposed to be going to therapy, but the government and the authorities were not implementing these rules. And I'm sure that if he had gotten the help he needed and was under that supervision, JC would have had a normal childhood. Her mom and her stepfather would have not had to go through that painful situation. And I mean, you can't really go back and change the past. However, it is important to note that not just as a country, but as literally a world, we need to work on preventing things like this from happening a little bit better, because this was preventable. If authorities had been doing what the court mandated, JC would have never gotten kidnapped at that time. But at the same time, if the government had taken Philip off of parole, like the state of California wanted to, then it wouldn't have worked. Nevada was the state that kind of thought that he was not ready to be introduced back in the world 100% free. And then the officers at UC Berkeley would have never found the girls. After I read this book, I learned that you need to be aware of your surroundings. Things that seem even slightly wrong or off are important to take note of. Philip was mentioned multiple times in the press because of his previous arrest. However, no one ever thought he was the man that had kidnapped this 11-year-old girl, because he was deemed as someone who would never commit something like this. And I also learned that it is important to fight for what you believe is right. The state of Nevada didn't think that Philip should be off parole, and that's how the California authorities found him and the girls. But the most important thing I learned is to get help before it's too late, and that applies to everything, whether it's for mental and physical health and or protection. If Nancy had realized the toxic household she was in, and if Philip had gotten that help he needed for his mental issues, maybe they'd be living a healthy, free life, even if it meant that they had to go to therapy. They'd be, not in prison, and JC and her family wouldn't have had to go through that. And so I think it's very important to get that help when you need it. I would rate this book a 4 out of 5. It was structured in a way where I felt like I was reading the script of a documentary, which was definitely a bit difficult to follow along in certain parts because the plot changed here and there, and the small details really made a huge difference. And as long as you're, reading everything and understanding what every word means, then you should be fine. However, I also did want to see a little bit more of JC's point of view. We got a lot of history on Philip's family, Nancy's family, but we didn't really get a lot of JC while she was kidnapped. I would have liked to know, what she was feeling, how raising those two, baby girls were like in those circumstances. But at the same time, I understand, she was kidnapped and it was traumatizing, I'm sure. And she was not ready to open up about that. And I don't know if someone can 100% ever be ready to talk about everything that happens to them, especially in those situations, which is understandable. But overall, it was a great book. It was written very great, and it kept me entertained the whole time. They talked about a couple of cases that they thought might have been related, but turns out it was a false alarm. You really got to see how journalists were really into it just for the money. And a lot of moments I was a bit mad because they wanted a story, whether it meant throwing the family under the bus or not. And it kind of sucked seeing how we've come to be like that as a society, caring about the money more than about the girl who was in danger. But overall, it was, like I said, a really good book, and I definitely recommend it. So yeah, thank you for listening.